Hi everyone, this is Intro to Africa at Flagler College. I'm Dr. Young. As with the last lecture, I'm filming this at home, and you may hear some background noise from people talking or something. My apologies for that. I also still have a cold, like the last time, so hopefully I can make it through this without coughing too much. So we're talking today about the last 3-4 decades, 1980s through the present here. And we began with the earlier part of the post-colonial era, the 50s through the 80s or through the 70s. I'm going to lay out some of the main features, both politically and economically, of this period, and then we'll look at some case studies from the period to see how these things played out in specific nations. So the political issues. By the 1980s, 2 decades into independence, and after enduring a great deal of corruption and mismanagement of the government, even kleptocracy in many cases, many people, in large groups of people in many countries in Africa, began to stage protests. These protests took different forms, sometimes strikes in industries, sometimes mass political protests. They didn't start necessarily in the 1980s, but the 1980s did begin to witness mass protests. We talked about South Africa last time, and the 1980s really was this time of tremendous upheaval, lots of political protests, and to some extent the South African example spread through the continent, inspired a lot of other countries to rise up against their ineffectual or unjust leaders and demand change. Now, the change didn't come immediately, but things did begin to move in the direction of change. Sometimes this happened through coup d'etat, as had been the case already, and sometimes the new regimes were no better than the previous regimes, but there was at least some movement in that direction. And another general trend, and again, this doesn't happen everywhere at once, and it's quite gradual, is the trend toward democratization and actual elections. Now, in many cases, the elections were rigged, lots of voter fraud, lots of ballot stuffing, and things like that. But at least they're moving in the direction of elections rather than just autocracy without elections or sham elections. And even up to the present, this is a continuing trend. I'm filming this in the summer of 2018, and in fact, just a few days ago, there was an election in Zimbabwe, really the first, I think, truly democratic election in that country's history, given that Robert Mugabe, at least since 1980, given that Robert Mugabe acted as a de facto dictator in that country for the last almost 40 years. And if you're watching this, in a later year, I intend to use these for several years at least. This is old news probably, and things probably have changed a great deal. But this was at least a democratic election. Of course, almost predictably, there have been accusations of voter fraud against the party that won, which happened to be the party of Robert Mugabe, just somebody who had overthrown him in a coup within the party itself, right? So these parties persist, and I'll talk about that in a moment here. In fact, I might as well go there. You can see the fourth point here under political issues is the persistence of liberation parties. These parties that were formed out of the group that led the struggle for independence were like weeds, we might say. They did not go away. In some cases, they did change to become more adequate rulers. In some cases, rival parties did emerge. But the liberation parties have hung on, some all the way to the present. ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe is a good example of this. The Zimbabwe National Union, Zimbabwe African National Union, I should say, which merged with the Political Front Party or Political Freedom Party. I can't remember what PF stands for. Anyway, this was Robert Mugabe's party. It has hung on all the way to the present, and Mugabe was ousted by people within his party. And that party has remained popular in Zimbabwe, even though Mugabe himself wasn't necessarily popular. And his successor in that party, the one who overthrew him, Mnangagwa, uh, was recently elected as the president of Zimbabwe. Right, so those parties have hung on in many cases. Um, and a big catalyst for this change, if I can get past this coughing fit, is generational change. Let me take a drink there. Okay. So generational change. The generation that fought for independence, that took over governing the newly independent African nations, found themselves unpopular with the rising generations by the 1980s, and often this is a kind of a second wave of youth leagues within the political parties or rival parties forming out of the younger generations to challenge the existing parties, and often these young people have been more educated, at least more socially aware. In recent years, social media has begun to have a huge impact on political change. We'll talk about the Arab Spring later, which is a great example of this in Egypt and other Middle Eastern countries, other North African countries, as well as other parts of the Middle East. The young people just simply fed up with the corruption and mismanagement of the governments, demanding change, starting their own protest movements, in some cases taking political action themselves. In some cases, these youth movements, these younger people, have proposed even more radical means. A good example would be Julius Malema in South Africa, who initially started out as the head of the Youth League in the African National Congress, but he was proposing radical reforms, specifically land reform, seizures of land owned by white residents in South Africa, and redistribution of that land to poor black people. And this, of course, was unpopular with the white population, but also was, resisted by most of the leaders of the ANC. And Malema eventually broke off to form his own political party, which is called the Economic Freedom Fighter Party. And they're characterized by these red berets that they wear. And Malema is a real fire breather, truly a radical, almost a kind of neo-Marxist in a way. And so, this generational change often leads down even more radical paths, just as, the generation that fought for independence often did so while courting the Soviet Union and perhaps opting for more totalitarian and less democratic parliamentary options, as we talked about earlier. Though that's not universal necessarily. Most African countries have found a kind of equilibrium, though that equilibrium may not be the right word in many cases. But a solution or an angle of repose might be a term there, a kind of resting place for the government. Sorry for the dog barking in the background here. But a term that has been used by political scholars commenting on Africa is the term presidential democracies. That is, most African countries have had a democracy of sorts. There have been elections, and different parties putting up candidates for office and things like this, and parliaments elected and so forth and so on. But the majority of the power in most African countries has been held by the executive authorities, meaning the presidents or the prime ministers of these countries. And so the parliaments, which are more, of course, representative of the people at large, have been marginalized and denigrated to a lesser status of governance. And these, it's really just the persistence of the big man kind of political strategy, really in so many ways traditionally African, right? But presidential democracies really has been kind of the rule of the day in Africa, and this is, I think, starting to change in some places as reforms have been proposed not by the heads of state per se, but by other groups, inside of parliaments or by rival political parties to the dominant party, and sometimes by outside pressure. So that's the general trend here. Another important element of politics in recent years, in the last few decades of African history, is really the rise of religious movements in both Christian and Muslim areas, and to some extent the increasing radicalization of these religious movements. And so Christian Pentecostalism has become tremendously popular across large swaths of the continents, and this is the very charismatic, often eschatological, meaning sort of looking forward to the end of the world kind of thing. We talked about the Zion Christian Church earlier. There have been later outgrowths of that sort of Christianity. To some extent, this is syncretic, but often this is a modification of Western models that Africans have taken their inspiration from popular Christian preachers, sometimes Americans like Billy Graham or somebody like that, and have set up these charismatic Protestant churches to function along those lines. Teachings like the prosperity gospel, which was popular in the United States as well, sort of in the 1990s, in the early part of the first decade of the 21st century. The notion that one can receive wealth and economic success by devoting one's life to Christ, and participating in these kind of charismatic services with lots of singing and dancing and other ecstatic sorts of activities. When I lived in South Africa in the mid 1990s, I went to a couple of these churches just more as an observer than anything, and only a couple of visits, mind you. I was not a regular, but that was really the emphasis, right? It was. I remember going to one church, and it was in a warehouse. It was a large facility, and there were probably several hundred people there on a weekday afternoon. And they had a schedule up that if you go on, and I forget the exact kind of details of the schedule, but if you go on Mondays, then the preacher will pray for you to have, success making money. If you go on Tuesday, then, go there if you're sick, they'll anoint you and pray for you to get better. If you go on Wednesday, then there's another kind of emphasis they have on that day, right? So, and this was very much one of these Christian Pentecostal churches. There was a lot of ecstatic stuff going on there in the service, people sort of jumping around and screaming and speaking in tongues and other things. It was, I certainly don't want to criticize anyone's religious beliefs or practices. It was something that I had not necessarily observed previous to that time. And it was interesting, to see the appeal of this in what was otherwise a very poor neighborhood, one of these townships in South Africa. In the Muslim regions, Islamic fundamentalism was often, and this is, the appeal, I think, is limited here, but enough people were sort of fed up with the autocracies of, for instance, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, that they were willing to look at the kind of charismatic religious leaders for help in this regard. And a lot, modern manifestations of Wahhabism and the Salafi tradition, these fundamentalist traditions, ran through an Egyptian named Said Qutb. He is pictured here on the slide. If you're wondering how to spell that last name, it's Qutb, or sometimes Qutub. The transliteration is different depending on sort of choice. But Qutb was an interesting individual. Really kind of began his career as a religious scholar in the 1930s and 40s, even traveled to the United States for a time to attend university. Ended up in Colorado, and one of the formative experiences that Coop had in the United States was he attended an American football game. And to him, this was the most barbarous thing that he had ever seen. This notion. I mean, the kind of violence of the game disturbed him, but even more the shouts of the fans to kill the opposing players, to rip their head off. I mean, whatever it was, he was really kind of disenchanted with this whole thing, and interpreted the United States and the West in general really kind of through the lens of these experiences he had in the U.S. And he began to teach about the necessity of establishing a society that was run by very strict adherence to Sharia law, and it really was the intellectual forerunner of many of the modern fundamentalist leaders, including most particularly Osama bin Laden, who absorbed the teachings of Sayyid Qutb, partly through the intermediary of his bin Laden's kind of right-hand man, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was also an Egyptian, a physician actually, who I believe had direct contact with Sayyid Qutb in the last few years of his life, or if not, I can't recall. He, certainly absorbed his teachings, and Qutb ended up being one of the most important thinkers in modern Islamic fundamentalism. You can see here in this picture that he's behind bars. He was in fact arrested and executed by Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 1960s for his teachings, which were really kind of anti-nationalist and certainly anti-modern, very much anti-everything that Nasser was trying to do in Egypt. But the movement that cohered around Qutb's teachings definitely gained steam over time, and among other things, evolved into Al Qaeda. Though even other parties like the Muslim Brotherhood, which was also declared illegal by Nasser, by the way, which, as we talked about in an earlier lecture, began in the 1920s. This with Hassan al-Banna as the kind of forerunner of this. The Muslim Brotherhood began to absorb many of these fundamentalist teachings, and this had much wider appeal, certainly than Al-Qaeda did, because it was less militant, but it was pressing for political change and did try to set itself up as the rival to the autocracies in Egypt and in other North African countries. So this is an important factor certainly in modern African politics, and we can point to really, I think, important moments like the Al Qaeda bombings of the U.S. embassies in simultaneously on the same day, same hour, in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, Kenya and Tanzania, in 1998, as an example of this, which kind of shook the continents. Al Qaeda had a lot of training facilities in Sudan, and in fact, these training camps were targeted by the United States after some of these bombings, and certainly after 9/11. And so these fundamentalists have had a real impact, and other groups have drawn inspiration from these North African ones, and into the Sahel. Other fundamentalist groups have emerged. I think most famously probably Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, who, among other things, have carried out mass kidnappings of Muslim, or rather of schoolgirls in other parts of Nigeria. There was a kidnapping of something like 200 schoolgirls a few years ago. Many of them have been returned, though some of them were taken as sex slaves or as wives, even, or concubines of the members of Boko Haram. And Boko Haram eventually pledged itself to the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS, right? And so, although I think they had a falling out with each other, and ISIS itself has been active in Libya and other places. And so, there a lot of these groups have drawn inspiration and really kind of date back to Said Qutb. But they've gone to some extent in their own directions here. All right, let's talk about economic issues. I think I went on a little bit about the fundamentalist thing, but I do think that this is an important factor to keep in mind. So, we talked about the post-independence economic issues, and many of those persisted. And as African countries became more and more reliant on international aid for really many of the basic necessities, the feeding of their people and things like this, the international agencies that gave loans and to some extent brokered the international aid coming into Africa began to press themselves for African countries to do things differently. That this state of affairs simply could not persist as it was presently constituted, right? And so I think the most important manifestation of this are what we call structural adjustment programs. And these were dreamed up by officials in the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, working kind of in tandem with each other. These are both bodies connected to the United Nations that provide economic aid to the developing world, often loans through the World Bank, but the IMF is, the one who administers this. And it was indeed officials at the IMF, starting in the early 1980s, who began to insist on this. Now, what are the elements of these structural adjustment programs? As the name indicates, they've got to, they get to change the structures of the economies within these African nations. And, the incentive here was that they effectively said, we're not going to give you more loans, and we're going to limit the amount of aid that you receive otherwise unless you make these changes. So a big part of this was privatization. The public sector in many African countries, given the fact that these were, largely, a lot of countries went for these socialist experiments and, grew the bureaucracies of their states into kind of these bloated behemoths. The IMF insisted on privatization, that the public sector had to shrink, that they had to hand power over to to private interests. They needed to stop manipulating the economy directly. They needed to kind of ditch the idea of command economies and let private interests take over the economy. There needed, in other words, to be more free trade and free market kinds of activities. Another one was austerity, that the governments needed to, sort of pull back from many of their large, to some extent, pie-in-the-sky projects that they had begun and impose austerity. This was a tough pill to swallow, certainly, as was privatization for that matter, because so many jobs were held in the public sector that it was, difficult to say, okay, we've got to shrink the public sector, which means that hundreds or thousands of people who currently have jobs in the public sector need to go find jobs in the private sector, which wasn't, functioning very well. So both of these things were not necessarily well received. They were seen as, overly harsh, overly punitive measures. But these were the terms the IMF offered, or demanded, I should say, in exchange for continued loans and aid. Another part of the structural adjustment programs was that they needed to stop manipulating their currencies. Many of these countries had held, and look, I'm not an economist, okay, even though I occasionally try to imitate one, and I'm certainly interested in economics, but I'm not sure about all of the mechanisms that are employed to manipulate currency. But there are certainly ways that governments can keep their currencies, whether it's simply by dictates or whatever it is, at artificially high levels, right? And they did this, for various reasons, really, to some extent, to keep the currencies from just collapsing in value. The IMF insisted that these African nations float their currencies. That is, they stop trying to keep them at artificially high levels, and they let them sort of float against the international exchange of currency to see where they would land. Okay. Now, currency manipulation is not something that is germane only to Africa. Lots of countries, I think, most famously, and the one that's most in the news is China, that the yuan is kept at artificially high levels because, or rather, sorry, artificially low levels, because China's economy depends so much on other countries buying goods that are manufactured in China that the Chinese want to make sure that their currency trades well against the dollar or the pound or the euro or the yen, so that other countries will find it favorable to go in and buy Chinese goods. This is one of the main reasons, by the way, why you can go to Walmart, for instance, or click on Amazon and buy Chinese-made goods at such affordable prices, because the Chinese manipulation of the currency means that we can buy things. Now, that also has negative consequences, of course, and President Trump, among others, has, in fact, President Obama even called for China to stop manipulating their currency. And China floated the currency. The yuan would strengthen in value given China's economic strength in general. But the Chinese have pushed back against this and tried to keep it at an artificially low level. And there are different reasons why a country would want to keep it at a high level or a low level. For the most part, African countries were trying to prop up their currencies and keep them at an artificially high level because they were mostly they were dependent on what the rest of the world was selling or giving them, rather than on what they were producing. And so they wanted to keep their currencies at a high level because that meant they were strong when it came to trading with others. Truthfully, when these currencies were floated, many of them did almost collapse, and the value collapsed. Zimbabwe here is another good example. Even in the last decade or so, the Zimbabwe dollar has become almost worthless as a currency. And I think at one point they were printing $1 trillion notes in Zimbabwe because, and that would probably be, the equivalent of like a $50 bill or something like that, right? Because the currency was just in free fall. And when that happens, when you have hyperinflation like that, and massive inflation is often the problem here with floating currencies, right? The wages are sticky. They don't move as fast as the prices do, and so when the currency drops in value, merchants immediately begin to charge higher prices for the things that they sell, but employers are far more reluctant to raise wages, and so people end up not being able to buy foods for nearly the prices that they could before. And this is really harsh on an economy, but the IMF saw this as a necessary corrective, and once the currency is just in free fall, then really the only solution is to do away with it and introduce a new currency, and that's been done a number of times in several African countries. So the privatization, austerity, floating currencies, the shrinking public sectors, all of this is part of this. All of these are elements of the structural adjustment programs. And there was a lot of pain initially with this. And some countries resisted doing these things and, tried to kind of go it alone rather than depend on international aid so much. In some cases, they actually had success maintaining their large public sectors. Tanzania did quite well. But others, gave in to the demands of the IMF and went for the structural adjustment programs and ended up, after a good deal of pain for several years, almost depression level kinds of things in many of these countries, they ended up in a better economic place with a larger private sector and more robust activities going on as a result of that. Another economic issue here, and really it's both a social and economic issue, is immigration. The countries with troubled economies or troubled political regimes were net exporters of people, right? Nigeria has been particularly notorious, though the Congo and Rwanda and Burundi have also been notorious for people fleeing these countries and going to other parts of Africa, often economic hubs like Johannesburg or Cairo, or often, of course, there are lots and lots of immigrants who have tried to leave Africa entirely to go to the United States. In the last couple of decades, the influx of African and Middle Eastern immigrants into Europe has been just staggering in proportion. Millions and millions of people leaving the developing world and trying to get into Europe. Large books with small print have been written about this. I've read some of them. These are often heartbreaking stories that involve tremendous, I think, courage, bravery, and daring to make these long treks, often from, across the Sahara or certainly across the Mediterranean, jumping security fences and running away from armed guards and dogs and things like this. I mean, as well as braving the kind of privations that come with traveling overland. But people have been willing to do this to try to find better economic opportunities, right? And I mean, we could throw in there refugees. The largest refugee camp in the world is inside the boundaries of Kenya, but the vast majority of the refugees, and at its height, this had like 500,000 people in it, were from Somalia and Sudan and other places to the north of Kenya that had collapsed political regimes or collapsed economies, and people were simply not safe and trying to look for some other opportunities. These refugee camps ended up becoming permanent. They started in the late 1980s, and eventually had schools and shopping malls and permanent structures for people to live in and other things. Though, I mean, obviously, still in abject poverty. And so, in some places, there are large diaspora communities. In Johannesburg, where I have some experience, for instance, in the 1990s, there were, entire apartment complexes in the central part of Johannesburg that were made up of residents from Central Africa, many of whom were fleeing the conflicts in the Congo or the Rwandan genocide or some of these things. And often the rivalries that had existed in Rwanda between Hutu and Tutsi, for instance, carried over into the streets of Johannesburg, right? So this can be a real problem. The Nigerian diaspora all over the world I mean, there are huge communities of Nigerians in other parts of Africa, and in cities in the United States and in Europe. The population of Nigeria is the largest of any African country, and it's not. I mean, in land size, not the largest country in Africa either, and so the overcrowding of cities like Lagos have led people to take sort of desperate measures to get out and find some other place to get work and to pursue economic opportunities. I would recommend, if you're interested in this topic, the fiction work of I think my favorite current African novelist, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, a Nigerian woman novelist who has written some wonderful both short stories and novels about the Nigerian diaspora. She herself was a student in the United States for many years, and often travels to the U.S. for book tours and things like this. So, and films have been made out of her movies, or out of her books, I should say. She wrote a novel about the Nigerian Civil War called Half of a Yellow Sun. One of her more recent works is called Americana, with an H at the end of that, which is about a Nigerian woman who goes to the United States, becomes a student, spends years there, and then goes back to Nigeria. So, these are all, I think, avenues into this very interesting issue that is not going away anytime soon. Most African countries have experienced GDP growth in the last few years. So their economies have begun to pick up. They've become more connected to the globalized economy. This has been, I think, both a blessing and a curse to some extent. The blessing that the GDP has grown, but often they have persisted in being too reliant on a few particular commodities, oil in Nigeria or coffee in Cote d'Ivoire or Kenya or some of these places. And so, even though the economies are becoming more diverse, I think, and more successful and more privatized and more free, for that matter, there is a really mixed record, and there's a mixed record of economic liberalization all over the continent. Some have continued really to have command economies. Some countries have tried to keep a tight rein on what's going on with the economy. Others have allowed for the increased privatization and more of a free market system. The informal economy is a key element of the African economic system. People just starting businesses, doing things on the side, right? And this is not Uber or Airbnb, like we would call the sharing or the informal economy in the United States, but small businesses like the one pictured here on the slide, a tuck shop, which is the name for these, all over Southern Africa at least, little places that, they go to the supermarket in a town that may be far away from where a lot of people live, and they buy up, basic necessities. The tuck shops that I frequented in South Africa when I lived there had usually things like soda and candy and chips, but also sometimes, some fresh vegetables, toilet paper, paper towels, things like this that were kind of everyday necessities. And, there was always a neighborhood tuck shop. Sometimes this was just a little more than, a child's lemonade stand for structure. Just a simple wooden structure made out of whatever boards they were able to find and nail up. But they had, some coolers or things inside that had soda in them, or, candy, toilet paper, things like this. And so, they cost a little more at the tuck shop than they would if you were able to make it to the supermarket. But the supermarket might be, a few kilometers away, and a person has to take public transportation, and they've got to haul their shopping bags with them on the public transportation. It's just easier, even if it's a little more expensive, to go to the tuck shop to get what you need for kind of your day-to-day necessities, right? Some tuck shops, in fact, have grown into quite large and successful businesses, permanent structures. The township that I worked in outside of Bloemfontein in South Africa, for instance, had a couple of tuck shops that looked just like convenience stores, but really were just these informal things. I think the one pictured here, and I'm not sure where this is at. This may be in Soweto or something, but this one looks like a fairly successful one here. And I think the one on the side there, by the way, might say car wash. They may offer, multiple services or something. Social issues, and a few of these of note. The growth of education and healthcare in Africa has been kind of by fits and starts, but definitely moving in the direction of growth, right? That healthcare has become more available to more people, and education, while not absolutely universal in Africa, has at least become more available. All right, that's the end of my water, so let's hope that I can get through this. Most African countries do have mandatory primary education, and some have mandatory secondary education. but it's a mixed bag, and often families will, especially in rural areas, will have no possibility of sending their children to school, um, because the schools are simply too far away, or the children are needed, to help farm or do something on the homestead. Even in urban regions, sometimes there's little beyond primary education. I remember when I was living in Botswana, in Gaborone, the capital city, that I became friends sort of with this teenager, whose family was so desperately poor that as soon as he finished, I believe it was like fifth grade or something, or the equivalent, whatever it was called there, standard 4 or 3 or whatever it was, that his parents told him, or his mother, I don't know if I think his parents may have been victims of AIDS, which I'll talk about in just a moment here. But the family needed him essentially to just go and work, right? And he was a street peddler. I mean, he's like 14, 15 years old. And, he would go and buy things like, again, I mean, he's really sort of running a tuck shop, except he didn't have any kind of structure. He just set up his goods on the side of the road and sold, candy and chips and things like that to people going by. I think he also offered to do things like fix shoes and other things like that. There were often shoe repairmen just sort of camped out on chairs with maybe a little bench or something to work at on the side of the road in Africa. And so, he was needed to do that, and there was no law that made him go to school for longer. And so he left after the fifth or sixth grade and went to work, right? I always sort of shuddered to think about his future economic prospects. I'm sure that they weren't good, right? But necessity is a terrible master sometimes. Continued urbanization. Cities just ballooning in size. Lagos, may have in the larger area 20 to 25 million people these days. Cairo, maybe 15 million. Those are, I think, the two largest urban centers in Africa. Johannesburg may have more than, I don't know, 10 million in the broader metro area, and it nearly joins up with Pretoria these days. There's almost continuous city going all the way there, so the whole thing is called Gauteng, the whole administrative area. Cities just becoming huge, right? And sometimes with skyscrapers, but most people living in, very crowded tenements and things like this. Though, of course, with sections of cities that are tremendously wealthy for the elites to live in, with private schools and private hospitals and even things like parks and country clubs and things like that for the emerging African intellectual and economic elite. And so, a lot of the issues of urbanization that appear in other parts of the world, though maybe exacerbated, maybe akin more to, say, the Gilded Age in the United States than to more recent times, though maybe we're in a second Gilded Age. I'm not sure here. Ethnic conflict, of course, has been a serious problem. We'll talk about the Rwandan genocides. We need to discuss here in the next lecture the book that's assigned for this week, Murambi, the Book of Bones, about the Rwandan genocide. That is the most troubling and kind of the prime example of ethnic conflict in Africa in recent years. But it's been widespread all over the continent. War, in some cases, even widespread war. The bloodiest conflict in history post World War II is one that probably most of you have never heard of. It's the larger Congolese War of the late 1990s that may have claimed 5 million people or more. It sort of started with the Rwandan genocide and reprisal attacks with Hutu refugees going into the Congo. Anyway, I'll discuss this later, but war has been brutal and bloody and often widespread, with countries getting involved in conflicts well outside their immediate circumstances, as happened in that war in particular. Um, the AIDS crisis, another terrible chapter in African history. AIDS began in Africa, probably, not probably, definitely mutated as a virus to move from apes to human beings, probably mid 20th century, 1950s perhaps, and became an acute crisis beginning in the early 1980s. And AIDS assumes a very different character in Africa than it has, for instance, in the United States, where it spread, of course, by the early 80s. AIDS, when I was growing up in the 1980s, was seen as primarily a disease of homosexual men and drug users. That it was spread through sexual contact. It is an STD, of course, and it primarily among homosexual men, at least again in the 1980s, and through drug users who are using dirty IV needles. That I think I heard statistics. I remember that 86% of all HIV positive people in the United States, this was circa 1987 or 88, something like that. 86% were homosexual men, and about 11% were drug users, and the remaining 3% were heterosexual people who received it through heterosexual contact or through blood transfusions or some other means like that. And so, this was, and there was very much a stigma in the U.S. about this. Now, I think that changed probably when Magic Johnson announced that he was HIV positive in 1991 because he had gotten it from heterosexual contact. And that made, HIV and AIDS more mainstream and really kind of brought it out of this, out of the shadows, as it were. And made it more real in some ways for a lot of people, at least for my generation, for Generation X, who was kind of growing up while the AIDS crisis was beginning. In Africa, it's been totally different, right? Primarily spread through heterosexual contact, and in places where there. Where polygyny is the norm, and where monogamy is perhaps the exception rather than the rule. And African culture is, I think, more free, especially when it comes to male sexuality, than other perhaps cultures of the West, and this is not universal necessarily either. But AIDS has been spread through heterosexual contact, and in some parts of Africa, entire generations have been decimated by this. It was called in parts of Africa the grandparents' disease because so many of the parental generation were dying of AIDS that the grandparents were the only ones left to raise the children. I saw this firsthand, quite frankly, when I lived in Africa in the 1990s, really at the height of the AIDS crisis. It has gotten a bit better since then. But when I lived in Botswana, and Botswana has, I think still today, but definitely then, 20 to 25 years ago, the highest percentage of HIV positive people in the world, of any country in the world. Now, Botswana is a very small country. It's also ethnically homogeneous, and it's one of the success stories of democracy in Africa, I think largely because of the ethnic homogeneity, that there's not a lot of ethnic conflict there, and it had this peaceful transition to democratic rule and everything like that. But HIV spread like crazy through Botswana, and it was estimated that more than 30%, 31, 32% of the population of Botswana was HIV positive. Now, if you can imagine that, right? And, HIV leads to AIDS. AIDS is, at least at that point, was considered a death sentence. It was the norm that a person who contracted HIV would have full-blown AIDS within a few years and would die. And I saw people dying of AIDS. Now, AIDS itself doesn't kill you, of course. It does away with the immune system and makes it impossible to fight off diseases, and people get very sick, usually with sort of common ailments, fungal infections. Most people with full-blown AIDS end up dying of pneumonia or something like that because their body simply cannot fight off viruses, other viruses, and bacterial infections, right? And so, uh, one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever seen. The house I was living in Botswana was just in regular neighborhood, okay, and this was definitely not a kind of Western compound or anything, though some of those did exist in African cities that I saw. And our next door neighbor was, well, I rarely saw her. I saw her two little girls. One of them was probably about 4 or 5, and the other one was a baby. I mean, she was maybe 18 months old, something like that. And this little girl was taking care of her little sister most of the time. She held her, she packed her around, she looked after her. They kind of ran wild through the neighborhood. Very cute little girls, very sweet. But their mother, it was quite obvious, was dying of AIDS and was going to be dead within weeks, months, something like that. She was skeletal thin and weak. She could barely get up. I saw her most of the time kind of lying down because I think her body was so riddled with various infections that she, could barely move. And, as I was only 20 years old, I was quite oblivious to this. I didn't think about the consequences. I hadn't become a father at that point yet. I mean, I would have a very different reaction today as a father than the one that I did when I saw that. I remember thinking, oh, that's so sad. It's tragic. But, otherwise thinking, not even considering what those little girls were going to do with the rest of their lives when their mother was passed on. There was no father or any male figure that I could see in the home. And I only mention this anecdote because I think that this became the norm in large parts of Africa. The education to try to halt the AIDS crisis was abysmal. The only effective way to stop this, and it's not even a fail-safe, of course, is to use some kind of prophylactic protection, right? Some kind of contraception that creates a barrier because, and the AIDS virus is a very small microorganism, the HIV virus, I should say, a very small microorganism, and, it can slip through the gaps at an alarming rate of a latex condom. But there were, I even met Western aid workers who were trying to distribute condoms all over Botswana, and it was an uphill battle. The government was not friendly to this. They had a hard time convincing them that this needed to be a public health issue, that there should be free contraceptives available to anyone who needed it, and free AIDS testing and things like this. Of course, it's going to demand some expense, right, from the government to do this. There were billboards up all over Gaborone. And I remember these billboards, they said, and I'm quoting here, contracting STDs makes you more likely to get AIDS. And I remember looking at that and thinking, no, they don't. That's totally erroneous, right? Getting syphilis or gonorrhea or herpes or something like that does not necessarily make you more likely to get AIDS. Having unprotected sex makes you more likely to get AIDS, right? They didn't say that. And I just have to assume that these billboards were run through some sort of bureaucracy and that they didn't like these more stark slogans, perhaps, or the real information. And so, they wanted to put something that was less offensive. I'm not sure why those billboards ended up there. They were not effective. I remember talking to teenagers that I knew about, their impression of the AIDS crisis, and they weren't worried at all. I was talking to one teenage girl I knew. I was very good friends with her parents, their family. Her father was the headmaster of the largest secondary school, largest high school in Gaborone, and her mother was a government minister for education. She worked in the education administration. And so you would think that they're going to raise children to know what's what. Well, Bonsi, that was her name. I remember talking to her about AIDS. I said, if you get AIDS, you die, right? And she said, no, you don't. I said, yeah, it's a terrible disease. And she's like, oh, I'm just not worried about it. She said, if I get it, I'll survive. I'm sure I will. And I just kind of wanted to grab her by the lapels and shake her a little bit to try to drive some sense into her. But I really think that that's part and parcel of just the lack of education that existed. And so it's not surprising. And I'm sorry for the personal anecdotes here, but to me, it's not surprising that AIDS spread so rapidly because, the education about this was just lacking in the extreme. Another experience, if I might do this, I volunteered at a primary school and got very close to a teacher. Her name was Josephine, and was talking to her one day, or rather, I came into her room one day, and she was weeping. She was sobbing, and I said, Josephine, what's wrong? And she confided in me that she knew that her husband had mistresses all over the country, that he traveled a lot, and he was sort of sleeping around. I remember, thinking what a wretched human being and all of that, and trying to console her. Again, if I knew then what I learned later, I would have driven her to a clinic and had her get an AIDS test or an HIV test, because I just have to imagine that he was exposed to it somehow and probably spread it to her. I don't know what happened to her. I fear the worst for her, right? So these are, and I'm trying to put a personal spin on this to, get beyond the statistics of the AIDS crisis, which are absolutely staggering. More than 30% in Botswana, somewhere around 20% HIV positive in South Africa, as recently as 2005, something like that. High incidence in many other countries. Those are the two highest, I believe. But, Uganda, I think it was like 9% or something. People dying in the thousands and tens of thousands, leaving behind children to raise themselves. Obviously, this was a massive social, economic, and political issue, and it remains so today. And the responses of countries have been abysmal in this regard. Okay, so we'll move on next time and spend some, kind of briefly talk about a few examples of the things that we've discussed today. And then, time permitting, or perhaps in another short lecture, I will talk about Africa today, some of the issues that remain there. And that will bring us to the end of the class, so we're getting very close. Thanks.